I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You dare once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here. And this is Trish Wood is Critical, the podcast on critical thinking, which is exactly what we need right now since the world is pretty much turned upside down. Let me start by saying that our Prime Minister had the audacity to say that Muslim parents who disagree with trans extremism in the schools only feel that way because they've been brainwashed by the far right. What would Justin do without the far right to blame everything on? And not only that, I mean, that's just so absurd. It's just so absurd. What an insult to these people. These, we're supposed to be cheering for diversity here. These lovely Muslim parents who are saying, no, we don't want pornography in the schools. We don't want our kids to be exposed to trans extremism. Maybe for religious reasons. I actually don't know why. I suspect it probably is. And they are standing side by side with people of other faiths and other religions and other reasons to try to shut this down. And he won't even give them the agency to have critically thought this through, which most of us have. And if you have critically thought it through, you're against it. And you've pulled your kids out of school, which I am advising people to do. That's the only way we're going to end this. That maybe and some lawsuits. But what a ridiculous and insulting thing for him to say. And if there are any parents in that group who are Muslim, who did protest and are protesting and feel insulted by our Prime Minister's dumb comment, let me say this to you. We don't think that. We welcome the fact that you are protesting and we can stand together against this issue. So he's just dumb. And you know what? Don't vote for him again. Stop that. This is who he really is. We've known for a long time, but this is who he really is. So please, just think about who we've got down there in Ottawa making us crazy with these incredibly dishonest and insulting pronouncements about things. I mean, honestly, it's just, I don't know how he says this stuff with a straight face, but he does. You know how he does it? He's not that bright. That's the truth. And the sad bit about having a prime minister who's not that bright and is getting away with it is that it really says how broken our democracy is. Look at Joe Biden. I mean, look at him, corrupt, demented, falling over, breaking diplomatic protocols in his visit with King Charles. I mean, it's just a joke. And he's there. No one's really impeached him. And same here. So, we these are not the leaders that we deserve. We deserve better than this. So do think about that at the ballot box, regardless of your politics. I don't bet based on politics. I bet based on rational thought and critical thinking. And so I'm certainly going to do that next time. And you know who I'm not voting for. Let's put it that way. If he dared to run again, he might. Imagine that. Anyway, I want to talk to you about our show today. It's going to be a bit of a cornucopia, a hodgepodge of things, because something very sad happened to me yesterday. We were all set, Steve and I, to record a really fantastic show for y'all late yesterday with a very high-profile person we've been trying to get on the show for a really long time. And we hooked up and connected with this person's studio setup, and we sat in our studio for, I think in total, about an hour and 15 minutes. And the way it started was, the person was 5 minutes late and 10 minutes late. And I was saying, oh, well, he's a busy guy. He's probably on a bit of an interview jag right now. So someone's kept him a bit longer. No problem. The time is ticking by. And eventually, we were contacted by his EA, who's lovely. And she said, no, he's coming, 20 minutes, etc. So we just, like fools, waited for an hour and 15 minutes for someone who didn't show. Someone I really admire, too. I hate it when that happens, don't you? And then he just said he couldn't do it. I think he said something about having sick children or something, and that was it. It was over. And so I was left with a show for today. We never miss shows unless I've got COVID, and no guests. So that's kind of a drag, right? And I will also say this: I'm not going to name him because I hear he's a decent bloke. So every dog gets one free bite. But he didn't even write me himself to apologize. See, I would have done that. I wouldn't keep someone waiting, and I wouldn't not show ever. But if that had happened because of a car wreck or something, I would have written a note, an email note, and even that didn't happen. But let's move on. Here's what I'm going to do for you today. I've got some wonderful tape I want to play. One of the things we're going to hear is it's a wonderful clip of Jordan Peterson on with Piers Morgan that I want to talk to you about. And it's one of the reasons I like him very much. It's probably, after I saw it, the main reason that I kind of re-embraced him after not paying too much attention for a while, when he came back from being ill and that sort of thing, I didn't really plug back in again. But this clip really, really meant something to me. And so we're going to play this for you. And then at the end of the show, I have a wonderful little 12-minute documentary by a very smart cat named Christopher Rufo, and it's called Transgender Empire. And you are going to love it. And I will also release it on my Substack, so if you want to watch the actual video with it, you can. But it does work as an audio clip. It's about 12 minutes long, and it explains the genesis of what we're experiencing now. And I hear from a lot of you, it's like, how do we go from 0 to 60, from no trans discussion to everything is all trans all the time, and if you make a criticism at all, you're a terrible person, you get arrested, right? How did that happen? Well, the answer is follow the money. And if you heard my interview in a previous show, I've forgotten which one, but it's easily findable in our archive, with Jennifer Bilek, Bilek. She's really the journalist who has cataloged the rise and rise and rise of trans extremism and who funds it and why it's happened so quickly. And it is really about money. Billionaire trans people. White males who have transitioned, who happen to be billionaires. One of them is a Pritzker from the Pritzker family of Illinois. His cousin or brother is the governor. And Martine Rothblatt, who was the head of Sirius Satellite Radio, and she sold it for a bunch of dough and actually lives here now in Canada. So mark my words, she's putting money into these gender studies places that end up advising schools and governments on how to turn kids trans. I feel that's what they're doing. There are obviously legitimate trans people, not disputing that, but they're super rare. And what we're seeing now is a taught behavior and social contagion. There's no question. Being forced on vulnerable kids, autistic kids, bullied kids, all kinds of kids, and gay kids, by the way. So we're going to play that for you at the end of the show. And you can, I don't know what you do when you listen, but it's a very interesting thing to listen to. He takes it right back to the very earliest stirrings of this in academic political theory. It's highly, highly connected to Marxism, people. Of course it is. Doesn't it feel that way? Doesn't it feel like we're experiencing something like Marxism when we enter this world where you cannot complain, you cannot criticize, you cannot make rational arguments, where you're forced to say something that you know is not true? They force you. And in the UK, this is true. If you misgender somebody, the cops can come to your house and charge you. If that's not Marxist, I don't know what is. So that video is going to play in our extra today. And it's worth sticking around for. It's really interesting. I know a lot of you have questions. And just so you know, I am going to bring on someone to talk to you about what to do if you are a parent. I got a call from a very loyal listener to this program a little while ago, and I talked to her about it because she had a relative going up to a camp, a teenage kids camp, and they found out that this camp is very transy, with the pronouns and the this and the that, and what to do about it. So I'm going to bring someone on who can talk to you about how to deal with your kids and how to frame it and how to fully understand it. So we're not letting that fall because it's important. The other thing you should know, if you don't already, is that Black Lives Matter, as it was started, had on their original website page, and I know because I've seen it, an admission. It was started by a lesbian or two who said that they were Marxist and that the focus behind Black Lives Matter was to destroy the heteronormative family, I think they said, or some phrase like that. And I know it's true because one of you wonderful listeners found it in the Wayback Machine and sent it to me. So that's a true thing. This is very, very scary. The other thing, if you read Andy No, NGO on Twitter, you should, is that a lot of people in Antifa are these trans people, and they're not the trans people who look feminine, the men who can look feminine because they're making an effort. These are the guys who kind of slap on a wig and a frilly dress and make no other changes at all. It's a really strange phenomenon. So, we're going to keep talking about this because we need to be aware. And I will bring someone on to help you through parenting during these weird times in which we live. So I'm going to talk about Jordan Peterson in a second. The show, I got a bit waylaid there, but the show today is the unlocking of the Colonel Douglas McGregor premium episode that we did midweek to coincide with the NATO Vilnius meeting in which Zelensky was throwing his weight around like a petulant child because he wasn't getting an insta admission into NATO, which is a very, very perilous idea. You know how I feel about that. I think it's dangerous. I think he's a crook. And I have nothing but enmity for that guy. I'm sorry, I do. He's not a hero at all. So Colonel McGregor was our premium, and I'm opening that up because we didn't have a guest for this week as a result of what happened last night. So I hope everybody understands why I've done that. I never don't have a show for you guys. It's important to me to meet this deadline every week like clockwork, because when I see you at events, you always say, I look forward to it. I know when it's coming. And some people even do some weekend planning about when you can listen to it. So I've managed to cobble something together for you, and I hope it's interesting. So let me do my pitch first. Then we will go into the Jordan Peterson clip that I think it's really important in understanding who he is. And then we'll go into the Colonel McGregor interview. So obviously, we rely on your support to keep going here. I do have staff that I pay. And we do that through Substack because it is a free speech platform. Some of the other ones aren't. Toby Young of the Free Speech Union was kicked off PayPal for a while, and then an outroar got him put back on again. Patreon kicks people off too if they don't like what's going on. And of course, we've talked about it on the show. People are being debanked all over the place now because they're not woke enough. So we have to support the platforms that support us, and Substack is definitely one of them. So what happens when you go to, it's the Trish Wood is Critical Substack. We will post a link to the podcast there with a little blurb about it, and that will open the gates. If you want to listen to it there, you can through the link, and then you can also make comments there, and our comment section is really taking off. So that's fun, isn't it? And then I try to get a Substack piece out every week or so, and I will for sure be in this one coming up connected to this show, putting in the Christopher Rufo video and the Jordan Peterson video, and also a video from Billboard Chris that you've got to see of him in front of a house somewhere in some small town in America, a really good neighborhood with people who were all in on trans and kids. All of these white women, these wealthy white women. It's astonishing to see it. He's trying to talk to them about the problem with what they're endorsing, and they glaze over invasion of the body snatchers. That's what Chris mostly experiences, or people who hate him and want to kill him, but it's just astonishing. So I'm going to include that as a little extra bonus, and you can have maybe a fun Sunday afternoon watching Chris Rufo and Jordan Peterson and Billboard Chris. There, I've curated a little channel for you. So we also have a merch store. I've got new stuff going in there, some really interesting ideas for hats and things for you to take to the cottage. The no hat is still a big one because that's kind of our bottom line. I think we're going to do a Don't Kill Cash hat too, because I'm super worried about digitizing currency and giving them all that power. So stuff's going to be arriving, and if you like it and buy it, then that money goes to helping this show, and you get a cool hat too. So my Twitter handle is @woodreporting. My email is info@trishwoodpodcast.com. I read everything you send. I try to reply to most of it. If I haven't replied and you need a reply, resend. I won't be mad. I'm just kind of overwhelmed here sometimes with emails. So so please do contact me. And my website is trishwoodpodcast.com. So you can find it there. Yay. Okay. So now I want to get into this Jordan Peterson clip because it was very moving for me. I think it says a lot about who Jordan Peterson is as a person. He was on with Piers Morgan, maybe like a couple of months ago or something. And an actress had accused him of being sort of the leader of the incel movement, or someone in the incel movement looked up to, or some awful thing. And of course, everybody hates incels. That's the in thing to do. And of course, a Hollywood actress, is going to feel that way too, right? They're all brainwashed. Incel, for people who don't know, is the phrase is involuntarily celibate, as I understand it. These are young men who feel completely alienated from society. They live in their parents' basements. They eat too much Uber Eats food. They play too many video games. They're inactive. As a result of all that, their testosterone is low and their lives are pretty crappy. And some of them have done violent things. And some of them say terrible things about women because they're lonely and they don't know how to navigate the world we live in now. That is not acceptable behavior, obviously. But we have to accept people that we are creating these little subgroups of people who we have abandoned and discarded and who are desperately unhappy. And that is not a good thing. So this kind of dismissal of the incel by an actress, and saying that as if it was pejorative, that Jordan Peterson is some meaningful spokesman for them or something. It was awful. And here's what caught me a little bit off guard, because I have a weakness. You may have noticed this, but I have a weakness for people who are struggling, even people who are misbehaving and are struggling. It's just a thing with my DNA. I always want to go to the people that nobody else wants to help. And I think that maybe Jordan Peterson and I share that. Obviously, he's a very empathetic shrink and a fine one. And he's done wonderful things for teaching young men how to think about their lives. So I'm not putting myself in his league. But I am saying I think we share that, because when he got teary-eyed, as you'll hear in this clip, I was bawling over it, right? And it made me like him so very much. We have to stop. We have to think about the labels we use on people who are struggling or different or outcast or whatever. And I am the mother of boys. I have two grown sons. And I know what the world is like for young men. It's not great, especially young white men. Well, I mean, it's probably bad for all young men, but young white men have a problem too. And that's that everybody hates them and devalues them. So I want you to listen to this. I believe you will hear Piers Morgan explaining what was said, and then you will hear Jordan Peterson's reaction.
I've got to wrap it up. I don't want to, but I have to. I want to ask you just quickly, the film director Olivia Wilde has a new movie out, which she says is based on you, this insane man, this pseudo-intellectual hero to the incel community. Incel being these weirdo loner men who are despicable in many ways. Is that you? Are you the intellectual hero to these people?
Sure. Why not? People have been after me for a long time because I've been speaking to disaffected young men. You know, what a terrible thing to do that is. I thought the marginalized were supposed to have a voice.
It's making you emotional, talk about that.
Well, God, you know, it's very difficult to understand how demoralized people are. And certainly many young men are in that category. And you get these casual insults, these incels. What does it mean? It's like, well, these men, they don't know how to make themselves attractive to women who are very picky, and good for them. Women, like, be picky. That's your gift, man. Demand high standards from your men. Fair enough. But all these men who are alienated, it's like they're lonesome and they don't know what to do, and everyone piles abuse on them.
What's interesting about that clip that went viral at the time was it went viral for the wrong reason. This is how screwed up our culture is right now. I think if you're a sane, empathetic, and actually kind person, you cannot help but be moved by Jordan's emotional response to these basement-dwelling, upset guys, right? He was excoriated for it. People were laughing about it as if being weepy and empathetic for a bunch of people who are struggling is a bad thing. This is how crazy our world is, right? So I just thought that was special. It's a clip I've always kind of remembered and wanted to share that with you because I think it says something about Jordan Peterson and about Hollywood. That's not a small thing. You know, they throw words around like, oh, he's an incel, he's this, he's that, because they think they're so cool. I bet Olivia Wilde doesn't even know what an incel really is. You know, she just thinks she's being a cool, whatever, chick, I guess. Anyway, so let's turn now to one of my favorite interviews of all time is always Colonel Douglas McGregor. This was a premium, but we've unlocked it because I got stood up yesterday. And I'm not going to name the person either because I'm just not. Yeah. Every dog gets one free bite. That's what I said, right? And Colonel McGregor is a really interesting guy. You used to see him probably a lot on Tucker Carlson on the Ukraine war, saying incredibly smart things. He's saying things that actual citizens really feel about this misbegotten disaster that's costing a fortune. But there was something really, really urgent about some of the things he said to me during this interview midweek this week. So, and I think that was because NATO was meeting in Vilnius. Zelensky was throwing his weight around like he does. And he also mentioned some statistics about how many soldiers have died, what is happening to the people there who get wounded, the soldiers. Nobody talks about that. It's all sanitized, isn't it? Yes, I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Here is Colonel Douglas McGregor on the eve of the NATO meeting in Vilnius. Hi, Colonel McGregor. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Good. So I guess we're sitting here as things are unfolding while we record this at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning in Vilnius. And the latest word I had this morning was that Zelensky had a bit of a meltdown because he wasn't going to be extended membership in NATO at this particular meeting. What do you know about that? He's always bitching about something, isn't he? He's never happy.
Well, the first thing is that, of course, he's desperate to drag Ukraine into NATO because Ukraine is not just a failed state, it's in a state of ruin.
Yeah.
And it's lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers who've been killed and wounded. It's frankly on its last legs. So the hope is that he could somehow or another get into NATO. Now, what they did do that has angered the Russians is that they've told Zelensky that instead of a quote-unquote two-step process, Ukraine would only go through a one-step process. Now, what precisely that means, I don't know. It may not mean anything. I don't think there will be much left of Ukraine when the time comes, given the inclinations of Mr. Zelensky and the people backing him.
I just want to follow up on something you said, just because sometimes things fly by, and I think it's worth remarking on. Did you say hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers?
Yeah, so we think that 300 to 350,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. And we suspect that you probably have an equal number or close to it who are wounded, most of whom are so severely wounded that they will never return to active duty. They're simply finished. The hospitals are full.
Oh.
It's a very grim picture indeed. And now, of course, for obvious reasons, there are large numbers of Ukrainians who are declining to attack. They've said, we've had it. There are large desertions, and you've had platoon and company-size elements surrender to the Russians. And that's not very difficult to do because most of the people fighting in eastern Ukraine are speaking the same language.
Yeah.
And contacting the Russians is not that difficult. And in one case, a company commander indicated that he was unable to evacuate the severely wounded soldiers at his location because Ukrainian command said, we can't do it and we're not going to do it. You're going to have to fight it out. And he said, if I do that, these men will be killed. So he surrendered to the Russians. And fortunately, the Russians throughout this campaign have always treated Ukrainian soldiers that were captured very, very well. So they knew they would be treated well. And as far as we know, they're now out of the fight. So I think we'll see more of this. There's also a great deal of anger building inside the Ukrainian military aimed at Zelensky, whose demands are unrealistic and inhumane.
Well, I know a thing or two, not obviously what you know because you were in war, but I did write a book about the Iraq War with some of the young people who came back, many of whom were in Walter Reed missing more than one limb. And I'm going to assume, because they never tell you this in coverage of any war ever, but that given that Ukraine is not about bang, bang, but about explosions, that we would likely be seeing a similar number of these kind of catastrophic amputations, which are life-ruining and not really able to be kind of dealt with in a healthcare system, right? Am I right about that?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. Now, you're asking for details I don't have, but I have been told by eyewitnesses that have gone to the hospitals, the field dressing stations, and so forth, that the wounds are terrible.
Ugh.
And, they describe people without arms and legs, severely wounded. I know they have problems with blood supply.
Yeah.
The point is that this is a lost war. It has been lost for some time. And the willingness of the United States and its allies to feed this fire has kept it going. And Zelensky, of course, was picked precisely for the reason that he is performing what he's performing. He's an actor, and he is saying till the bitter end, we will give up nothing, change nothing. And he's been promised, I suppose, both safety and riches for his trouble. But we do need to remember that back at the end of March, beginning of April, Zelensky had expressed the view that he was prepared to accept neutrality for Ukraine as part of these negotiations. And of course, at that time, Boris Johnson, the prime minister, flew in and informed him that was out of the question, unacceptable, because the Americans had told Johnson to go and do that and said, if you continue this war, we will supply you with whatever you need. We will back you to the hilt. Well, I think we've been backing him and we've supplied him, but it looks pretty grim right now for the Ukrainian people, and millions have left the country. We think at least 12, perhaps 14 million. I think the population is down to somewhere around 20, 21 million, maybe 19 million. We don't know. And of course, if you turn to the mainstream media or any of the Western governments, they're not going to tell you the truth because the truth is ugly. And when the truth is ugly, only a lie can be beautiful. So we live with lies in the West. The Russians have been remarkably honest based on the standards of the past. They've largely told the truth. They may not have always told the entire truth, but I know that they have tended on the whole to sort of lowball the statistics on the numbers of Ukrainian equipment and people that have been killed or captured or destroyed. So it's a tragedy that simply should end. There's no chance whatsoever of ever driving the Russians out. Everybody knows that. And the question is, what can you get if you negotiate? I think the truth is that now the Ukrainians aren't going to have much flexibility because we've robbed them of it.
Robbed them in what way? You mean because they're losing?
Yes,
Yeah.
their position is pretty much hopeless. And now this latest announcement that, well, we're going to go to a one-step process, which means we're going to make it easier for Ukraine to ultimately join. I think that will probably induce the Russians to take very dramatic action. So I would expect offensive operations to begin in the near future. Right now, you've got 300,000 troops that have been sitting in reserve, largely because I think Putin was watching carefully to see whether we would intervene in Western Ukraine. And he wanted to have a hammer that he could pull out and slam at us if we did. I don't know if that's even reasonable to expect anymore, because I don't think we have the numbers, the equipment, the ammunition, the staying power. I don't think the allies want to do it. The only people who have expressed any interest in that sort of thing are the Poles and Lithuanians.
Wow. Is there a sense from Zelensky's statement that he made where he kind of said that, I think the phrase was that the reluctance to just give them a clean walk into the door to NATO, he slammed that as weakness and absurd. And that was actually a slam against Biden himself, if I read that correctly in the New York Post this morning. Is Zelensky going to go rogue at some point? I mean, I thought he was kind of a puppet of America. Now it sounds like he wants to sort of kick butt or something. What do you think is going on there?
Well, remember that Zelensky was picked by the powerful and billionaire oligarch Kolomoisky. And they essentially picked him up off the stage and told him, you're going to run for president, and this is your platform. And he ran on a platform of peace. And the Ukrainians at the time he ran for office were overwhelmingly supportive of some sort of arrangement to make peace with the Russians. So he won handily. Only a small number of Ukrainians in the far west of the country near the Polish and Hungarian borders did not support him. Everyone else in the country did. And of course, what he did was the exact opposite of what he said he would do. So presumably this is something that was planned from the beginning. This whole project has collapsed. It's in ruins. And there is no future for Ukraine in the current set of conditions. He knows that. So his only saving grace, I guess you would say, is to find a way into NATO. He's assuming that, well, if I join NATO, I get into NATO, then I get the nuclear guarantee, and that will keep the Russians out. Well, he's not going to get it. And I think everybody knows that.
I wonder, I mean, he just has the feeling of a kind of a Las Vegas opportunist to me. I mean, that's just the vibe I get, and I can't really.
I think you're right.
That's just everything about him. I don't trust him. But this is purely hypothetical. You probably don't like hypothetical questions, but I mean, could we see it? Since we lived through the recent fake kind of coup of Putin in Moscow, will we see a time where if he's really losing, he'll just take his gazillions that he's siphoned off and move to Miami or something like that? I mean, is that like he'll just disappear maybe from Ukraine?
I would anticipate that at some point. I'd be very surprised if we did not learn when the game was really up that he was on his way to somewhere else. He allegedly owns property in Venice, Italy, as well as outside of Miami. I don't know the details, but the corruption in that country is mountainous. It's just enormous. He sits atop it. And I think the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation, if you will, is dying as a result.
Yeah.
It was bad when this thing got started back in 2014. Their first opening salvo after the coup that installed this government that was responsive to Washington was to attack the two so-called breakaway republics, which were just simply Russian republics that wanted equality before the law and equal treatment and human rights and everything else. And he's been going strong ever since. They killed, 14,000 people before the Russians actually intervened in February of 2022. So I don't see any future for the man in the current setting. I think he knows that. So his best shot is, how can I persuade NATO, led by the United States, along with our trusty sidekick, London, how do we persuade the world to let him alone and leave him there? And I think he's beginning to find out that he's not going to get what he really wants, which is NATO intervention on the ground. Now, having said that, remember that at this summit, there was supposed to be a discussion about the Poles and the Lithuanians jointly intervening in Western Ukraine. I haven't heard anything about it, but that was supposed to be the topic of discussion. And the presidents of Poland and Lithuania both said that once the conference was over, depending upon what was discussed and decided, that they would go in jointly into Western Ukraine, but not with NATO backing. In other words, independently of NATO.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Now, that's nonsense, by the way. You know that.
Yeah.
I mean, from the Russian standpoint, they will be viewed as a Trojan horse for NATO.
Yeah, of course.
They're of the alliance, and so the Russians will attack them. And I think the hope is that will drag the rest of us in.
Oh, that's just like the most horrifying scenario. Just getting back to Zelensky for a minute, my feeling about this guy is that if anybody still is laboring under the false idea that he was a statesman who gives a single care even about his own people, because we see war like this at an arm's length, but to be in Ukraine and see the destruction and the human tragedy and the hideousness for the surviving soldiers who've been blown up, and to still act this way tells me that there's something wrong with him, that he's not a statesman. He's something else, and he's an opportunist. He's something else entirely. And I think we've got to, the only question for me in Zelensky is, when this thing is over, is he going to be welcomed, to party with Jay-Z and Beyonce, or will he be a kind of a hiding in some Dhaka in Croatia or something? Like what's going to happen to him? And I think whatever happens will be directly created by how the media portrays this thing at the end of the day, because they're the ones responsible for giving him even the one iota of credibility that he ever got, right? He is mostly a creation of legacy media, isn't he? His reputation.
Oh, I think that's true without question. I really don't know. I know one thing: he's absolutely not going to Croatia because the Croats would dispose of him. I'm sure.
Well, I just picked Croatia because I thought all the corrupt people ended up there with really nice houses. But
no. Croatia's not the destination for this man.
No, Miami.
The place for him is Miami. I mean, you could put him in New York City, but I think he's probably going to end up somewhere near Miami. I don't know what he's going to do. And there are a lot of people in Ukraine that would like to ensure he doesn't go anywhere but 6 feet under, I think, before this is over. The great tragedy is that you're right. He is a piece of fiction.
Yeah.
But then I would argue that most of what's been happening is, and I think the Ukrainian people were sort of badgered and misled and misinformed and didn't really understand what they were being dragged into. And now it's just a tragedy on an international scale. Now, what happens when this is over? And the real question is, what's going to be left? I mean, what kind of infrastructure will there be? And all of the Ukrainian refugees that are interviewed on the way out, at least the ones coming to the West, because at least 2 million went east, are saying the same thing. We will never go back.
Yeah.
What do you do? I mean, if you can't get the population to return, how do you rebuild?
Yeah.
It's an awful picture. And again, the lack of human kindness and understanding at the very top in Kyiv is abhorrent. I mean, right now we know that the press gangs trying to force people into the Ukrainian military to fight are now being either avoided or actually attacked in some cases in Western Ukraine, because the people in the far West now are being dragged in to fight. It's ugly, and I think the truth will come out about what a disaster this was from the outset and the terrible human carnage that resulted. But you're right, the legacy media isn't going to help us get the truth out. There will be no one that will want to tell this story. And when you say legacy media, you have to include the public broadcasting system.
Yep.
Along with CNN and everything else, all of whom have joined this bandwagon of insanity that's caused this war to happen. Now, the thing all of us worry about is desperation. People in Washington are desperate. People in London are desperate. People in Kyiv are desperate. When I say desperate, well, you've got people in the West that don't want to admit that this was a terrible decision to go in and back this entire insanity. They don't want to be revealed for what they are. They don't want to admit that they have been misinforming and lying to the American people, the British public, and others. So that's one problem. They're prepared to do almost anything to avoid admitting the truth. Then you have Zelensky and his crew and the people that have been backing him directly. They're very worried about their survival, and one wonders what they're prepared to do or what they can get others to do. And this, of course, is the question of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And he and his friends in Kyiv have been talking for months about what they would like to do, essentially creating the equivalent of a dirty nuclear bomb by somehow or another attacking the nuclear power plant. And they were always accusing the Russians. But the International Atomic Energy Agency has been there to inspect. They've come back and said the Russians have shut down most of the reactors. They have taken all the prudent measures to protect it, and they've protected the whole plant from several attacks by the Ukrainians. So we know the Russians absolutely do not and will not support any action that would result in any nuclear accident at Zaporozhye. But that's not necessarily true for Zelensky. And a lot of us are very concerned about that.
Yeah, well, me too. Me too. And you know what else I'm concerned about? This is a bit of a broader question, but I sort of feel like, when are we going to learn? Like, when these misbegotten adventures happen elsewhere in the world and everybody's lining up to cheer and put in the Ukraine flag or whatever war it is, you know, we always regret it. And I run a show based on critical thinking. So we try to bring that to every story we cover, including this. We were one of the early critics of it. We never thought Zelensky was heroic. We had lots of people on from Consortium News and others who were saying that. We took a lot of hits for it. I knew we were right. We kept going. But at what point as a culture in the West do we learn that the legacy media and the people who are governing our lives do not tell the truth about foreign affairs and war and kind of geopolitics more generally? They just don't, do they?
Well, I would argue that Woodrow Wilson, who took us into the First World War against Germany and Austria-Hungary, he was certainly misinformed by Colonel House, who was a British citizen, about what was happening in Europe.
Yeah.
And he had an opportunity to intervene early on and bring peace to Europe, certainly in 1916.
Yeah.
Instead, he did the opposite. Now, that's one part of the story. The other is that FDR did everything in his power to goad the Japanese into attacking us.
Yeah.
If you go through the papers of Stimson, the Secretary of War at the time, he says, "Thank God the Japanese attacked us. If they hadn't, we'd have had to attack them in 2 weeks to get this war started." And then, of course, FDR began supplying the communists under Stalin in July of 1941, providing them with the wherewithal not just to survive, but to be successful. And people should take time out and look at the Lend-Lease and what was involved in it. We demanded nothing from the Soviets, but we demanded payment immediately from the British, and we managed to bankrupt and destroy the British Empire, which appears to have also been one of FDR's goals. And then we can go forward. The Korean War was something sprung on us that we didn't pay a lot of attention to. We didn't understand it, but we had a president that understood that there was no interest in the United States in marching into China to fight an endless war. His name was Eisenhower, and he put an end to it. Then we come along in 1965, we have another lie. The lie that gets us into Vietnam based on the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was total nonsense. I mean, we could keep going.
Yeah.
You go back to this Afghanistan thing and the notion that people in an obscure cave, 200 or 300 maximum in Afghanistan, justified the intervention in and destruction of much of Afghanistan and the rebuilding of the heroin industry. That doesn't make any sense. That wasn't called for. And then, of course, you have the invasion in Iraq, which was based on the utterly fallacious notion that there were WMD developments in that country when we quickly established there were none. And frankly, we knew before we went in, but we decided to go in. I mean, there's an awful lot of disinformation, lying, prevarication, call it what you will, that's gotten us into a number of things. I mean, very lately, I was talking to someone who was actually a news person in the media, in the mainstream, And I said, well, whether you like Donald Trump or not, isn't it abundantly clear that this whole Russia connection to Trump was a lot of nonsense? And he hemmed and hawed and said, yeah, well, that's true. I said, well, has it occurred to you that we're going through the same thing now with Russia and Ukraine? Oh, no, this is completely different.
Yeah.
And Americans, they're easily misled. I don't know what Canadians are like.
Same.
But too many Americans are too quick to rush forward, pick up the flag, wave it, and say, yes, we've got to do this.
Well, we like our little narratives. We like comfortable narratives, and the media knows how to spin them. I wanted to move on to something that happened, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, this kind of strange, kind of fake coup, or at least it was called a coup by legacy media. I interviewed somebody from Moscow who said that is not what's happening at all. What is your take on what happened?
Well, Evgeny Prigozhin is probably Russia's first contribution to reality TV. He is an interesting character who continues to attract more attention than he deserves.
Yeah.
My view is, first of all, there's no uprising, no mutiny, nothing like that. He seems to have decided that he needed to shake up things because he's very unhappy with the conduct of the war in Ukraine. And he has a lot of support with the Russian people. And I think he has a certain amount of sympathy inside the Russian military. What I'm talking about is as follows. He is sick and tired of this long, unending conflict that he knows could be ended very quickly if the whole Russian military went on the offensive. And he says, we've sat here long enough. We've waited long enough for common sense to return to the people in Kiev. It's not coming. We've done so much damage. They have no hope of securing themselves or withstanding us. So let's end this. And I think he decided he was going to send this group to Moscow to make the case directly to President Putin. And people mistook this for something that it was not, which was an uprising. There was no support for a Prigozhin uprising. Nobody inside Russia was going to rush to his side to support him against President Putin. President Putin's enormously popular. But then again, so is Prigozhin, and his Wagner group are heroes inside Russia for the enormous sacrifices they made and the successes they achieved on the battlefield. So he I think, tried this. It didn't work, at least insofar as the way in which he chose to do it. But he has since had a meeting along with 34 of his officers that lasted for 3 hours in the Kremlin with Putin. And they have now emerged from this. He's gone back to St. Petersburg. Some number of contract fighters, the estimate is about 8,000 out of 25,000, are in Luhansk, and they are going to go up to Belarusia, where facilities are being built to house them. And the rest of the Wagner group is being enlisted on contract with the Russian army. Now, I think that's about it, and I wouldn't make too much more of it. Now, who were his targets of abuse, if you will, and anger? Gerasimov, the chief of staff of the general staff, and Shoigu, the defense minister. And he's furious with them. He blames them for the slow, deliberate way they've conducted things, and blaming them for this thing lasting as long as it has, and so forth. Neither of those men is being removed, and I can't imagine that under any circumstances would President Putin remove them under pressure from him. But having said that, I think you're going to see some shakeups in the senior ranks. I think they've already occurred in some areas. And ultimately, I think the conduct of the war will change. I don't think they'll sit much longer, especially after this Vilnius meeting.
Yeah.
But, I could be wrong. I thought that they would have attacked as soon as the ground was hard in June. They decided to let the Ukrainians bash themselves to pieces, which was probably the smart thing. But at this point, Ukrainian attacks have sputtered out. Ukrainians are on the ropes. And I think there's good reason to move. But of course, again, as I mentioned early on, President Putin, from the very beginning, has not wanted a conflict with NATO, and specifically does not want a conflict with the United States. Secondly, when this conflict ends, he wants to be able to live with the Ukrainians. He doesn't want to rule them. He doesn't want to annex the place, but he would like them to be neutral, and he'd like to be able to do business with them. Now, those are two critical goals that shape his thinking. We don't appear to have any interest in that at all. First, we don't seem to care about the Ukrainians and how many of them die or how many of them leave the country and what it costs. We are interested in essentially controlling as much of it, or I guess BlackRock and other investors are interested in controlling it.
Yeah.
And then otherwise, we seem to be committed to this illusory goal of, quote unquote, hurting Russia. And as I point out repeatedly to people, when this whole thing began, there were perhaps 220,000 regular troops in the Russian army. And today they're up to 750,000 and climbing. They'll be at 1.2 million, I suspect, with it by the end of the year.
Voluntary? Is it voluntary?
Yes. Yeah, well, most of it's voluntary, but you still have draftees. You still have 134, 135,000 draftees every year.
Yeah.
But my point is that if your goal was to somehow or another prevent Russia from becoming or acting as a great power military, gosh, you've done the opposite. You created the very thing that you said you were setting out to prevent. And the Russians are not going to back down from anything. I mean, again, as we've discussed before, Trish, what happens in Mexico is actually of existential importance to us, although you'd never know it with these open borders and the drugs.
Yeah.
But truthfully, it's very, very dangerous. And we do regard what happens in the Caribbean and in Mexico as of existential interest to us. Well, the same thing is true for the Russians in Ukraine.
Well, I wish you cared, too, about what's happening up here, because we have kind of a dangerous government, too.
Well, we have a problem, as you know, with drugs coming in from Canada and illegals.
Yeah. Well, I also just mean that the people in charge right now are pretty nutty. And I always hope Tucker Carlson used to always say they were going to rescue us, which may be why he lost his show. I don't know, but
first we have to rescue ourselves.
Yes, you do. We all have to rescue ourselves. Let me ask you about the cluster bomb story, because I don't think people really fully understand the significance of what that means. Is that a huge upping of the ante, the fact that America has committed to give Ukraine these weapons to use that are absolutely outside the bounds of all human rights organizations, are they not?
That's my impression. And having seen the cluster munitions employed during the Iraq War, quite frankly, we thought their military utility was so modest as to not justify their use. In fact, whenever they were used, they were a problem for us because we usually had to drive through them as we advanced towards the opposing force.
Yeah.
And in most cases, it was not an issue for those of us who were mounted in armored fighting vehicles, tanks, Bradleys, and so forth. But it was a huge problem for the trucks, the Humvees, the wheeled vehicles, the light-skinned vehicles that were behind us. And as a result, we had serious damage to them. A lot of people were injured. Fortunately, nobody was killed. But then after the war, the sort of multiplicity of these things all over the place became a problem because, as you would expect, civilians that didn't know what they were dealing with would pick them up, especially children. And so we thought after the Gulf War was over, well, this cluster munition just isn't worth the trouble. And we had the impression that wasn't going to happen anymore. Plus the fact that a huge dud rate, much larger than is admitted publicly. Mm-hmm. So I think what really has happened is we seem to have run out of conventional high explosive warheads for 155 millimeter artillery ammunition. And what we've got left are these old shells containing bomblets.
Wow.
Or cluster munitions. And I think that's the real rationale for sending them because I think somebody said, well, if we don't send these, we haven't got anything to send. Of course, the intelligent thing is to say, look, we don't have any more munitions.
Yeah.
We can't make any more quickly enough. It's time to talk to the Russians. That would be the rational move. If you can't provide the ammunition that you promised, you've got to turn to the Ukrainian regime and say, you need a ceasefire. We need to come to terms with the Russians. But no one seems interested in any kind of reasonable peace. I mean, I've tried to tell people that at least historically, until Franklin Roosevelt went down this stupid road of unconditional surrender, we tended on the whole in Europe and in the United States to try and reach agreements that we recognized were often imperfect.
Yeah.
But the objective was, let's stop the killing. If we can stop the killing and we don't like the arrangement that comes out of the first agreement, well, there will be opportunities down the line to revisit the agreement and make appropriate changes. In other words, people seem to have had more concern for human beings and economic prosperity and stability than they do now.
Well, and I think with the use of these things that America has lost I never had a high road here, but it's like really gone now. Jake Sullivan actually said about this, if I read the story correctly, that the danger to civilians from cluster bombs is actually worse without cluster bombs because it's saving them from the terrible Russians. I mean, what kind of crazy moral landscape are we living in here when that's how he's justifying doing this terrible thing that will last for a while, right? Is it like landmines that they can last for a generation after the conflict ends?
I know that they'll be lethal for some time. I can't say how many years, but clearly
it's just ridiculous.
It's a huge problem.
Huge problem.
I mean, I can come up with a lot of justifications for the use of mines. I mean, militarily, there are real reasons to establish minefields. And we've seen that with the Ukrainians who've driven into these minefields and have been unable to advance. So that you could rationalize from a purely military standpoint. It has value, but these things don't, in my judgment. We just don't need them, Trish. And I maybe Sullivan doesn't know. He has no experience with the military. Maybe he's simply reading what was written for him.
Of course he was. Yeah, I think so.
I mean, I have to assume that.
Yeah, I think so.
If I were in his position, I'd have a lot of trouble with it. I'd have to say, look, if you want me to go out and say this, I can't because it's not true. So I'm happy to resign. But nobody seems to ever do that. We don't ever have anybody that stands on principle for much of anything. I always say to people, that ask me, what about all the generals, the retired generals? Why aren't they saying something? Well, they are. They're on the payroll.
Yeah.
They're not going to help you. And I said, how many people resigned over what went on in Vietnam? How many people resigned over what was going on in Iraq when we started to occupy the place? And lots of people, our British allies among them, told us we were doing a lot of stupid things. We're going to make life much harder for us. And they explained to us the futility of presence patrols. Why are you constantly reminding these people of your presence?
Yeah.
All you're going to do is annoy the hell out of them, and they're going to shoot at you. We've learned that the hard way.
Yeah.
We could go on, but we don't seem to listen, and nobody at the top sees anything that justifies any serious action. In other words, nobody's willing to stand up and say, look, I've come this far. I can't go any further. Thank you very much. I'm retiring. Nobody does it.
Well, it's the same kind of crew, I think, that if you want to use Iraq for an example, that, the run to Baghdad was pretty successful. I mean, it was a kind of a class.
Well, how could it not be? There was nothing in front of them, for God's sake.
No, but it worked. And where things went really sideways was when they were kind of tasked to running the country they now owned and didn't.
Yeah, well, it's called occupation.
Yeah, the Green Zone and all those crazy people.
I'm trying to remember the name of the author who wrote something about the Sands of Empire. It's a brilliant book. I think he's Pakistani. But everybody knew that the last thing you wanted to do was have what in the eyes of the Muslim Arabs in Iraq is have a European Christian army occupy them.
Yeah.
Forget it. It's a dead end.
Yeah.
And the decision to stand down the Iraqi military, the administration, all on the grounds that I think it was Wolfowitz and Feith and Cheney and others would say, well, we're denazifying Iraq. Yeah. Well, that's ludicrous nonsense. I mean, whatever they didn't like about Saddam Hussein, those characters wouldn't know a real Nazi if they stumbled over him. It's just absurd. But this is the kind of nonsense we went through. It cost us trillions of dollars. We lost a lot of people for nothing. Yeah. We're still sitting in Syria, and a lot of us have wondered, what are we doing there? It doesn't make any sense. But, Trump recognized all of these things, but he was subverted, obstructed, and didn't know how to do business in Washington, to be blunt. He just didn't.
He sure didn't, unfortunately. Last question to you, because I know you got to run, but is it true? I was reading something this morning about how the Brits are going to give Zelensky these missiles that have a nuclear capability that could shoot some kind of a nuclear warhead into Russia. Is that true? And if so, how can that be okay?
Well, I think they're saying that the missiles could carry a nuclear warhead, but the only way the Ukrainians could launch a missile with a nuclear warhead is if the British provided the nuclear warheads.
Yeah.
I don't see any evidence that the London government has gone that crazy. So I don't think that will happen. But, the Shadow, I think it's called the Shadow Storm missiles.
Yeah.
They've done some damage, but most of them have been intercepted and shot down. But they are capable of reaching targets in Russia, particularly in Crimea, which I think has been a top priority. But it's not going to make any difference, Trish. I mean, it's like shooting BBs at this point. It's not going to change anything. And if anything, it's going to strengthen Russian resolve to move forward and end this. That's the issue. If you think, or if anybody in the West thinks that announcing that Ukraine is going to have a one-step process to join NATO is somehow or another going to persuade the government in Moscow that, oh gosh, we should be afraid, we'll back off, it's going to have the opposite effect. I've tried to tell people, if you really want Russian soldiers on the Polish border, you're on the right track, because ultimately that's the Russian response that says, look, we'd like to live with a neutral Ukraine, whatever it turns out to be, however large it is or small. But how can we do that? Because at every turn, we're being subverted and we're being told to shut up and tolerate the advance of NATO ever further to the east. And they fear, and rightly, I would say, the sudden appearance of American Aegis missiles or similar systems that are, in fact, nuclear capable showing up on their borders. Wow. This has got to stop. This doesn't make any sense. This is not 1983. It's not 1903. I mean, the thinking is all backward.
Okay.
We don't live in that world, and Russia is not the Soviet Union.
Yeah, they can't get it through their heads. Last question requires a yes, no, or not yet answer from you, Colonel. Have you been approached by Bobby Kennedy, Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, anybody in that world as a possible SecDef in a new administration?
No.
Really? I'm going to start. No, I'm going to bang that drum. I that's where you should be.
Yeah, but you've got to understand that everybody knows that given the current status of the Senate, that in a confirmation hearing, I would never be confirmed.
Seriously?
Nobody in the Senate wants anybody who comes into office in the Department of Defense and says, first, a lot of things have to change fundamentally. And then secondly, we need to make it smaller, reduce it in size in order to rebuild it and make it useful for the future. Everybody wants to spend money. So the way you get the job is to promise to come in and pour more money into the black hole. I will not do that. And so as long as you have the Senate that we have today, I have no chance of ever being confirmed for any cabinet position.
Well, I pray that one day those things will change, because this is a very, very dangerous time. Thank you, Colonel McGregor. I'm always grateful to hear from you. Even though it's dire, you always make me feel smarter. So that's good, right?
All right, Trish. Thank you.
Okay.
Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That was Colonel Douglas McGregor being smart. Like he always is. So we're going to end with this little 12-minute documentary by Christopher Rufo. 1.8 million views already on Twitter. Wow, look at that. I mean, documentaries have traditionally been the purview of the left, and we can't get stuff on Netflix. We can't get stuff on Amazon. I can tell you that right now. I was doing that. I produced a 5-part series for Amazon, big budget. It's the last thing I did before COVID. That's what was my career. And I could never interest them in this kind of subject matter now. So, but let me tell you that the documentaries being made outside of the left-wing documentary film loop are doing better. What is a Woman? How many gazillion views? And now Christopher Rufo. This is a little 12-minute explainer, but it's pretty popular. So we're kind of breaking down that barrier too. Docs have been the purview of the left. No longer. We're doing our own. And if the streamers don't want it, that's fine. We'll find a way, because we always find a way, don't we? So just before we go into it, I want to read you one really annoying thing. Here is the headline in the Toronto Star. Storytime opt-out sparks parent protest. It's a weird headline, right? What does that mean? Board asked to apologize for decision to let students skip drag queen event. So it's not parents protesting the drag queen event now. It's parents protesting the board not forcing kids in school to sit through a drag queen event, right? How nuts is that? Here we go. Parents and staff are demanding that the Toronto District School Board stop allowing students to opt out of drag queen storytime events. Toronto PFLAG, which I think is Parents and Friends of Gays or something, and the board's 2SLGBTQ plus Community Advisory Committee, who's on that, I wonder, have been advocating unsuccessfully for weeks since the issue over attendance and consent arose at a Pride celebration at Bruce Public School in early June. They say the opt-out violates the Ontario Human Rights Code and are calling for an apology for the harm caused by the decision. The board, they add, has not been particularly responsive. But the board's directive remains the same for now, according to the TDSB, which is Toronto District School Board, which said the accommodation was offered based on guidance from the Ontario Ministry of Education. Ministry spokesperson Grace Lee said the decision was made by the TDSB. I mean, whatever, right? But here we go. So these parents, they don't stop. Like it's like they get everything and more. They are the most protected class in the world right now. There's a really funny meme of a guy, he goes into a bar or something and the bartender asks him a question. He says, "What do you mean? I can do anything. I'm trans. I never," it's true. They're not protesting because people don't want to have the drag queen show. They're protesting because they want to force people to have to go to the drag queen show. And they say it's whose human rights are being violated by that. I mean, and this is on, hey people, the front page of the Toronto Star. Can you imagine that? These advocacy groups are out of control. And we need to find out who's funding them and what we can do about it, because they send these advisory committees into the school board, into the schools, all into companies, and they sell them this extreme party line. And that's it. Everybody surrenders. It's insane. So that's not good, and we don't like it. Okay. Christopher Rufo's film is called Transgender Empire, and here it is for you. It's about 12 minutes long, and then I'll be back at the end of it to say goodbye. 1.8 million views already on Twitter. There you go.
The transgender movement has conquered American life. Activist teachers have converted classrooms into propaganda. Influencers are driving billions of social media impressions, and doctors are cutting up kids in the name of gender-affirming care. The story goes deeper than you might imagine, featuring rage-filled intellectuals, a trans billionaire benefactor, and large-scale medical experiments in a Detroit ghetto. This is the story of the transgender empire, how it came into being, and how it hopes to change the face of American society forever. In order to understand what's happening with the trans movement, we have to begin with a short history lesson. In the late 1980s, a group of writers, including Judith Butler, Gail Rubin, Sandy Stone, and Susan Stryker, established the disciplines of queer theory and transgender studies. They argued that gender was a social construct used to oppress racial and sexual minorities. They denounced the categories of man and woman as a false binary that upholds a system of heteronormativity, the white, male, heterosexual power structure. These writers made the case that these systems must be ruthlessly deconstructed and turned to dust. And the most visceral, dramatic way to achieve this is transgenderism. If a man can become woman, if a woman can become man, they believed, the entire structure of creation could be toppled.
A trans movement manifesto is intended as a secular sermon that unabashedly advocates embracing a disruptive and refigurative genderqueer or transgender power as a spiritual resource.
This is Susan Stryker, one of the founding theorists of the trans movement. In her best-known essay on Performing Transgender Rage, Stryker argues that the transsexual body is a technological construction that represents a war against Western society. I am a transsexual, and therefore I am a monster, Stryker writes. And this body, Stryker says, is destined to channel its rage and revenge against the naturalized heterosexual order, against traditional family values, and against the hegemonic oppression of nature itself. There's something important to understand here. The transgender movement is inherently political, using the construction of personal identity to advance a collective political vision. Some trans activists even believe their movement represents the future of Marxism. In a collection of essays titled Transgender Marxism, Rosa Lee argues that trans people can serve as the new vanguard of the proletariat, promising to abolish heteronormativity in the same way that orthodox Marxism promised to abolish capitalism. Lee writes, in a different era, Marxists spoke of the construction of a new socialist man as a crucial task in the broader process of socialist construction. Today, in a time of both rising fascism and an emergent socialist movement, our challenge is transsexualizing our Marxism. We should think of the project of transition to communism in our time as including the transition to new communist selves, new ways of being and relating to one another. This is the great project of the transgender movement, to abolish the distinctions of man and woman, to transcend the limitations established by creation, to hitch the personal struggle of trans individuals to the political struggle of revolution. All of society must be reorganized to affirm their identities and, more importantly, their politics. So how did the trans movement suddenly move from the fringes to the center of public life? Because they built one of the most sophisticated ideological pipelines in American politics. It begins with a flood of cash. In recent years, some of the wealthiest people in the country have spent enormous sums of money subsidizing the trans movement. Jennifer Pritzker is one of them. Pritzker, born James Pritzker in 1950, served a career in the United States military and inherited a sizable part of the Hyatt Hotel fortune. In 2013, Pritzker announced a male-to-female gender transition. The newspaper celebrated Pritzker as the first trans billionaire, and almost immediately, Pritzker began donating untold millions to universities, schools, hospitals, and activist organizations to promote queer theory and trans medical experiments. Meanwhile, Pritzker's cousin, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, signed legislation pushing radical gender theory in the state education curriculum and directing state Medicaid funds towards transgender surgeries. Here's Governor Pritzker speaking to an audience of trans activists.
Tonight I'm here to say that our state government is firmly on your side. We're going to make sure that all transgender Illinoisans are ensured their basic human rights and that health care services are provided to them so that they can thrive.
Here's how the scheme works in practice. Pritzker funded activists at Chicago's largest children's hospital, provide local schools with training, materials, and personnel promoting child gender transitions, using the reputation of the hospital to provide their ideology with a scientific veneer. These are some of the materials. As I've uncovered through investigative reporting, the activists and teachers associated with Lurie Children's Hospital expose children not only to trans ideology, but to kink, BDSM, breast binders, and artificial penis packers. The goal, according to the Children's Hospital, is to disrupt entrenched norms in Western society and to guide vulnerable students towards transgender medicine as the cure. Meanwhile, trans activists flood social media with propaganda.
It's because of this one part of my body that
The Chicago area detransitioner, Helena Kirshner, describes her transition experience this way. When I was 15, I was introduced to transgender ideology on social media and began to call myself non-binary. Over the next few years, I would continue to go deeper and deeper down the trans identity rabbit hole And by the time I was 18, I saw myself as a trans man. The result is a sophisticated school-to-gender clinic pipeline. Teachers, counselors, doctors, and influencers, many of whom are governed or subsidized by members of the Pritzker family, all push kids towards the science and politics of transgenderism. Highland Park, Michigan is one of the poorest and most miserable cities in America. It's nested within the city of Detroit and has been plagued by poverty, violence, crime, and death for decades. The city can't even afford to keep the streetlights on. But there is one institution in Highland Park that is overflowing with funds, the Ruth Ellis Center. The Ruth Ellis Center is Metro Detroit's central laboratory for the synthesis of transgender science and politics. The center's marketing pitch is an amalgam of all the fashionable left-wing buzzwords: trauma-informed care, restorative justice, harm reduction, racial equity, and gender-affirming care. The last one is the most significant. Each year, the Ellis Center and its partners conduct large-scale medical experiments on a population of predominantly black youth who've run the gauntlet of homeless shelters, foster care, juvenile hall, and the streets. Dr. Maureen Conley is a pediatrician at Henry Ford Health and leads the Ellis Center's medical partnerships, providing puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgical referrals to scores of Detroit kids.
Transitioning is an umbrella term to describe the process that someone goes through to bring their external self more closely into alignment with their gender identity. Typically, that's masculinizing or feminizing medications or hormone therapy. People can also choose to pursue gender-affirming surgeries, which are surgical interventions to bring their body more closely in alignment with their gender identity.
Keep in mind, these are not the white, affluent, educated, male-to-female trans individuals who are the public face of the movement. These are poor, black, traumatized youth from the furthest reaches of the Detroit ghetto. They suffer from enormously high rates of family breakdown, substance abuse, mental illness, and suicidal behavior. And they're told that gender transition, the latest promise of therapeutic liberalism, will solve all their problems. The most elite members of our society, affluent, highly educated, left-wing female doctors, are using the marvels of modern medicine to manufacture the ultimate oppression, the poor, black, trans woman.
I think I might have been about 8 years old when I remember having any thought of being transgender or gender nonconforming. It felt like I was an outsider to this whole world of America. On top of not being, a European American, I was black.
The doctors at the Ellis Center have created the new face of the proletariat, the highest authority in the intersectional hierarchy, and they've embedded the revolution into the very biology of their patients. In 1818, the novelist Mary Shelley wrote a book titled Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. The premise of the book is that modern science, stripped from the constraints of ethics and nature, will end up creating monsters. The trans-affirming doctors are the postmodern iteration of Dr. Victor Frankenstein. They promise salvation through transition, but end up creating disaster.
I think what we're becoming very known for at OHSU is genital surgery, and a prime example of that is a procedure called phalloplasty, which is the creation of a penis.
Dr. Blair Peters is a plastic surgeon who uses he/they pronouns and performs transgenital surgeries at the publicly funded Oregon Health and Science University. Peters specializes in phalloplasty, the creation of an artificial penis, and vaginoplasty, the creation of an artificial vagina.
And we now have a robotic vaginoplasty program. We have the highest volume on the West Coast. And this has been a kind of game changer for patient care, as we're now able to provide 2 cases a day in a single.
But the most revealing surgery performed by Dr. Peters and his colleagues is known as nullification. In this procedure, doctors perform a castration or a vaginectomy on the patient, then create a smooth, continuous skin covering from the abdomen to the groin, reducing the genitalia to nothing. This barbaric procedure is the perfect symbol for the ideology itself. Nullification is the pursuit of the Latin nullum, meaning nothing. And that is exactly where trans ideology ends. A profound nihilism that denies human nature and enables barbarism in the name of progress. Although this movement enjoys a certain measure of elite support, there is no doubt it will end in tragedy. Jennifer Pritzker, Maureen Connolly, and Blair Peters occupy the heights of power and prestige, but like Dr. Victor Frankenstein, they will learn a hard lesson. No matter how advanced their castration machines become, the trans activists and doctors cannot abolish the reality of man and woman. They cannot transcend the limitations of creation, and to the extent that they try, they will elicit the same heartbreak and alienation captured in the final scene of Mary Shelley's novel. The hulking monster, shunned by society and betrayed by his father, filled with suicidal despair, drifting off into the ice floes, a symbol of Promethean hubris meeting its final consequence.
That was Christopher Rufo on his mini documentary called Transgender Empire. And it's made so you fully understand how we got here. Did this happen overnight? It sort of did. The seeds were sown, but then billionaire trans people started dumping money in and capturing various institutions. And so I hope this helps you be maybe less afraid of it now that you understand it more. It is simply a story of institutional capture driven by money, like so many other things that are wrong in our culture right now. So I hope you can put it in that perspective. As I said, I'm going to do a Substack tomorrow. I'll put a whole bunch of cool videos in there for you to check out over the weekend. And I will also put a link to Jennifer Bielek's blog, The 11th Hour, because she really has done pioneering work on the roots of this trend. And it's a very, I could stay on that blog for days just reading and learning more. So I'll include that too. Anyway, I hope you have a great weekend and keep thinking critically. See ya.